So welcome. I think we just need to get started here because, again, it's a very packed agenda. I'm going to do a very brief introduction and we will get right into the program. There are a few things that I would like to cover to get started. First and foremost is thank you for taking time out of your personal life, your evening, to spend time with us to actually learn a little bit more about the California Environmental Quality Act. And how you can get involved. It's really because of community involvement that this process works. And so big round of applause to you for dedicating the time and effort and energy to be here. This meeting is being recorded. Wanted to let you all know that, and it will be posted on the California Air Resources Board's website for later public viewing by those who unfortunately weren't able to attend, or others statewide that would be interested in joining us. My name is Scott Wall. I work for the California Air Resources Board, and I am it's called the Community Air Protection Program. I am the Community Air Protection Program liaison to the community of Stockton, and gladly have been with Stockton since the beginning days of their steering committee through the AB 617 program. I did send everybody Zoom slides. We're not going to go over those tonight. To start us off, to save us some time, because it's a very robust evening. And I did in those Zoom slides put Brian Moore's email address, and Brian will put that in the chat now. If you're having any challenges with the Zoom controls or aren't terribly familiar with it, please feel free to reach out to Brian, and he is happy to help you with that. I want to very quickly also acknowledge a few folks that have been instrumental in getting this workshop series off the ground. I know that Mary Elizabeth is not here yet, but she'll be joining us. She had a last-minute meeting that she had to attend. She should be joining us here shortly. Jonathan Pruitt, thank you. And they have been instrumental in actually informing what this workshop is, in kind of building up the attendance and getting folks involved. And so I really want to acknowledge their significant efforts in getting us to the point where we are now. And then you'll be hearing much more from them as we move through the evening here, but Winter King, Carmen Borg, and Mindy, they are with Shoot Mahali and Weinberger, and they have very generously donated their time to bring this content to us tonight. They've created the slides, the handouts, and so they've been a delight to work with, very kind of like listening to community input, and have been phenomenal. So huge thanks to our friends from Shoot Mahali and Weinberger. And then finally, I would also like to acknowledge in the room my CARB folks, Michelle Byers, Brian Moore. They're helping with a lot of the background and logistics for the meeting tonight. And so would like to express appreciation and acknowledge them. One more thing I want to share with you is that we did originally kind of bill the Native American tribes and CEQA as being part of the content for this evening's, the second workshop, and unfortunately just couldn't fit it in with as aggressive and as big as the content is that we're going to be covering tonight. So what I did is my commitment is I'm going to follow up with you with some training materials and fact sheets that will actually address the Native American tribes and CEQA. And if within the community of Stockton, there seems like there's a lot of interest in kind of putting that out to a follow-up workshop, certainly I've heard from Winter that that's something that they are all ears, assuming that there's the interest there to actually have that be a workshop if the materials I sent you aren't sufficient enough. And then the final thing I want to share with you before kicking us over to Shoot Mahali and Weinberger is just to let you know that the next workshop, which is the third workshop in the series that we've created here, it's the Strategies for Mobilizing Others is the name of that workshop. If you have already signed up for the first or the second workshop, you will automatically get notification of that workshop availability. And I'm thrilled to let you know that Catholic Charities, Diocese of Stockton, has offered to actually through a community air grant that they've received from the California Air Resources Board to take the lead on that workshop. And I think it's just fantastic that that's kind of coming from somebody local that is going to be able to speak to kind of Stockton specific kind of ways of getting things done. And so that workshop will be focused on how to organize community members to take action on CEQA projects. And so you will be seeing more directly from Catholic Charities. So the next invite and information about that workshop will be coming directly from them. And the date is still being determined as they begin putting together the logistics for the workshop that they'll be hosting that will round out the series. So with that, I am pleased to hand this over to Winter, it looks like. And so I'm running the slides, so you might hear a little bit of banter between me and Winter and Carmen and Mindy. So please bear with us, and I will hand it over to you, Winter.
All right, well, thanks, Scott, for the kind words and the introduction. My name is Winter King. I'm an attorney with Shute, Mahoney & Weinberger. We're an environmental and land use law firm based in San Francisco. And with me tonight are my colleagues Carmen Borg, who is an urban planner, and Mindy Jean, who is an attorney as well. And we do a lot of work in the world of the California Environmental Quality Act. We spend a lot of time looking at environmental documents. And so we're so happy to be with you here tonight and share a little bit of what we know. We had a really great time at the last meeting, so thanks to those of you who started with the first workshop and continued on tonight. And also thanks to those new folks who are just joining us this evening for the first time. So you can go to the next slide. So agenda for tonight. First up, this is going to be quick, but we wanted to do a very brief review of the CEQA process and requirements for environmental review. This is really covering the territory that we already covered in the last workshop, but just a little refresher to those who were in attendance, and perhaps a little something new if you weren't at the last workshop. Now we're going to move on. The focus of the first workshop was sort of getting to know the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, as we call it for short, what it is, what it does, how it kind of opens up doors for public participation. And tonight we really wanted to do a deeper dive into how does a member of the public review an environmental document and make comments that are going to be persuasive and effective in these CEQA projects. So with the new content for tonight, we're gonna first cover what to look for in CEQA documents. So how do I know if the lead agency, which is you know, a public agency, a city or county, for example, how do I know if they completed the correct documents and provided us with the public with all the necessary information? And then the third bullet point here, engaging with CEQA as a resident or community-based organization. We're gonna go into kind of what comments are gonna be most effective for you as a commenter, and we'll give you some tips and some language to use to really fine tune those comments to the public agency.
Okay, so like Winter said, we're going to do a quick review. I'm going to talk pretty quickly, but if you need to ask questions at the end, I think we'll have a few minutes to do that. And like Scott said, the first session is available on YouTube as well. So CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, is a state law. And the intent of it is to protect the environment. The way it does that is that it requires public agencies to consider what impacts the project will have and look at how they can lessen those impacts and also inform the public about it. So the three main objectives of CEQA are environmental protection, disclosure, and this is, you know, where the agency has to inform the public about the environmental cost of the project, And then it allows for public participation and agency review. So the public gets to review the document. Other agencies that might have to provide permits for the project get to review it as well. And the lead agency issuing the environmental impact report has an obligation to respond to comments. So that's pretty key. Next, we'll look at the different types of environmental review. If there's not a project as defined by CEQA, then you don't have to do environmental review. Some projects are exempt from environmental review, and that's because it's possible that the project will not have an environmental impact. Thank you, Scott. Sometimes, though, it's purely a political call. Like, for example, there's a statutory exemption for sports stadiums in the state of California. Negative declarations it's a project that requires some review, but all the impacts are thought to be mitigable, or you can compensate for the damage. And there's a little bit of review opportunity for public comment, but not as much as with an environmental impact report. That's the most thorough kind of review, and the agency has to respond to your comments, unlike the other documents. And then there's the addendum. This document relies on a prior EIR or negative declaration, and it's pretty minimal additional information. They don't even have to circulate a document. They frequently just put out a Brown Act notice saying that there's going to be a meeting about it. And then they just file a form called a notice of exemption. Okay, so let's go over the process really quickly. First, you have the agency will issue a notice of preparation for a scoping period. And typically there's an initial study that's produced especially for a larger project. Here, the public gets a 30-day comment period. So they collect all the information about what the community is concerned about, and then they prepare a draft EIR or a DEIR. When that's ready, they issue a notice of availability, also called an NOA, and the public gets a specified amount of time to review the document and submit comments. And that's a hard, fast deadline. So you have to really pay attention to, is it a 30-day review period or a 45-day review period? You can ask for an extension. They're not obligated to give one, but you have to submit comments by the end of the comment period. So now the lead agency has gotten comments from the public. They're obliged to respond, and then they prepare a final EIR, which contains all of the responses to the public comments. And if they don't respond to all of your comments, you can point that out because they are obligated to. And then finally, so with the final EIR, by the way, they don't have to provide a lot of time for the public to review it. The rule is they have to release it 72 hours before the meeting to certify the EIR or approve the project, which typically happens in the same meeting. So that's not a whole lot of time. And you can certainly make some noise about that and ask for more time, but they're not obligated to give it to you. And then there's certification and approval or not of the project. CEQA doesn't require a public hearing for certification approval, but in order to take any action, they need to do that in a public forum. So typically you do have a hearing with EIRs. Not all state agencies take action in a public forum, and one agency that's kind of notorious for this is Caltrans, which frequently approves projects without a public meeting. So for those sorts of projects, you want to get in the habit of checking CEQA.net, which is a web page online. And I believe that's in your list of resources that is posted as part of the packet as well. Okay, so quickly, the required parts of an EIR. We're not going to look at all of those sections this evening, but we're going to look at the highlighted yellow ones because they're pretty key sections, and we'll get into a little bit of detail of what to look out for each one of those parts. And next slide.
All right, this is back to me. This is just a very high level breakdown of what an EIR is supposed to do. And I wanted to take a quick step back and just note that we're focusing on comments on an EIR because it's kind of it's the biggest and most complicated of the environmental review documents. But as we get into the discussion of how to do comments and how to review the analysis, you know, all of this advice and tips applies as well to if you're reviewing something that's not an EIR, like a negative declaration, which is what Carmen was explaining is a kind of lesser environmental review document. But for an EIR, there's really 3 things that every EIR should do, and should do it well and in a way that a regular member of the public can understand. First is to describe the project that's under consideration, and it should describe the entire project. It shouldn't leave anything out. It shouldn't just be focused on, for example, oh, we're building this little off-ramp to the freeway, and not tell you that that off-ramp is actually going to serve an entire new subdivision over here. It's got to describe the entire project that's under consideration and all the components. Second, and this is kind of the meat of an EIR, it has to discuss what the environmental impacts will be of the project. And I've underlined some terms here, which are kind of technical CEQA terms. And, you know, as we go through, CEQA has a lot of sort of special language and terms of art. So, you know, make notes if you don't understand certain terms or if you're not quite sure what they mean, and we can certainly take time to answer questions, or you can discuss them in your breakout rooms. We're going to have a couple of breakout room exercises, but the terms I've underlined here are potentially significant. So really an EIR, it's not looking at every possible little tiny environmental impact, but it's supposed to look at the potentially significant impacts. And then, of course, it's supposed to focus on the adverse impacts. So if something is going to have an environmental benefit, that's not something that needs to be discussed in an EIR, although it can be, but it's not a requirement. And then the third topic that needs to be covered, and this is what really, in my view, makes CEQA great, is not just saying, oh yeah, we're going to do this thing, it's going to be terrible for the environment. The EIR also has to have mitigation measures. So basically steps that the project applicant could take to make the project better, and alternatives. So, you know, this project applicant wants to build a ginormous shopping mall that's going to pave over every square inch of this agricultural field, for example. Well, you have to think about whether there are alternatives that would still achieve the project goals, but have lesser impacts. And so that would be, you know, maybe you could do a smaller shopping center, or make it taller and not cover quite so much of the field, things like that.
Cool. And so another one of those CEQA kind of catchphrases, and it really is a variation on what Winter was just talking about. So this significant effect on the environment, this is really kind of what is at the core of what CEQA is trying to get to. So as Carmen mentioned, CEQA requires a full disclosure and analysis of these environmental impacts or effects. And the goal is for the agency to also do what's within their power to reduce these harmful effects on the environment that result from the project. So what's on the slide is the kind of like very formal, the legal CEQA definition of what a significant effect on the environment is. And the main thing to focus on is the highlighted text. So basically, public comment should really tease out what the negative physical impacts that a project will have on the environment are. And whether those impacts or those effects are significant or substantial, as the law defines, that's really something that tends to get teased out more when you do have a lawsuit. And often lawyers, that is one of the many fights that lawyers will have when it comes to CEQA cases, is that impact actually significant? But it's helpful to know that that is part of the law, because when you're thinking about writing effective comments or presenting these issues to the agency, it is helpful to give context to them, to describe in your own words. It doesn't have to be scientific by any means, but to describe kind of really how big these impacts are. So if you have a warehouse, for example, instead of just pointing out that the warehouse will have air pollution effects on the communities, noting specifically which communities those are, or how many communities are located around the warehouse will be helpful there too. So turning really quickly to the second paragraph here, CEQA does not require analysis of any effects or impacts that are only economic or only social. So an example, although you could always find an argument, I think, but an example would be if you have a regulation that increases the price of parking tickets. Increase the price of parking tickets. If you can't tie that price increase to any kind of environmental impact, then CEQA doesn't require that you analyze those impacts. So, yeah. And so really quickly, actually going off of the example that I just mentioned. So if you have a warehouse project, what kinds of environmental impacts or environmental effects might you want to bring up to the agency? If people want to type in the chat some impacts that come to mind. Mm-hmm. So air pollution is definitely one, but obviously not the only one. Yeah, traffic. Pollution from trucks, yes.
Noise. We're getting some thoughts in the chat.
Yeah, and we'll have a lot of opportunities later on to talk about
protected species, some aesthetic impacts, farmland conversion. I think we've got some experienced CEQA commenters in here.
Water impacts.
Water impacts, yeah. All right, I think we've covered quite a few. Smog too close to homes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
took a minute to warm up, but man, that ended up being a lot of great stuff in the chat there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, we'll definitely have time later on to talk about all of those too. So yeah, next slide for now. Yes, cumulative impacts. So how a project contributes to all the impacts that are brought on by other types of similar projects. Cool. Cool. So one common tool that comes up is this CEQA Appendix G form. And basically it's a sample form of the different kinds of environmental impacts that an agency should analyze in their environmental impact report. And so this form is not exhaustive. So if you think of impacts that aren't necessarily listed on this form, those are certainly required to be analyzed by CEQA too. CEQA requires that the agency analyze all significant environmental impacts regardless of whether they are on this list or not. I think the Appendix G list kind of serves as a good like floor to consider, because even if an agency doesn't follow this list to a T, their environmental impact report should cover the substance of what this form is getting at.
So I'm seeing on this, Mindy, just a couple things other than what was in the chat. You know, cultural resources, greenhouse gas emissions, which we think, you know, typically think of as being part of air quality impacts, but kind of get their own separate line item there. Geology and soils, those are getting pretty technical, but you know, if you're building by a fault line, what does that mean? Recreation, utilities. Some of these have sort of special meanings in CEQA, because you're really trying to get at, okay, if we build this thing, are we going to need to build a new fire station to go along with it? And what impacts will that have? But it's, I think it's nice to look at this list and be reminded that, you know, that to think broadly about what the impacts could be.
And actually, and climate change too is usually like folded in the greenhouse gas section. All right, so our first poll. So answer yes if you've ever commented on an EIR, and no if you haven't before. Wow, I would
Looks
not
like
have
we've got
guessed.
about 14 folks who responded. So give folks maybe another 30 seconds to respond if you'd like to give us a yes or no. Thank you. Seeing the number still ticking up a little bit. And then I will share the results actually once. Okay.
Hey, Scott, in the interim, I had a quick question for Mindy or Winter. We had would damage to existing infrastructure be something under CEQA? Or is that separate? Like we had, I've heard concerns of like a new warehousing where increased truck traffic is using like, let's say residential roads, and it's actually damaging the current road, or even that the houses along that road because of the extra vibration and weight, and the road just wasn't designed for that kind of truck traffic. I don't know if that would be something you'd comment on through the CEQA process, or it'd be some other thing, you know?
Yeah, I'll pipe up and say usually, I mean, that sounds to me like that is an effect on the environment. It's the built environment. So I think it would be a great comment to make that it needs to be covered. I think the usual response you would get from a public agency is first that there's sort of a separate world of development impact fees where the lead agency is going to be charging this warehouse some impact fee to kind of cover the cost of infrastructure projects that might be necessary as a result. And then they'll probably also say, well, if this damages somebody's house, then they can, you know, that's sort of a private property thing. But I think that under our broad definition, that's certainly an impact on the environment. And you could suggest mitigation for it, right? You could say, hey, I want a condition of approval that says we're going to study the impacts on the roads over the next 5 years. And if they're degraded by this, you know, much, then you're going to pay into a fund, or you're going to repave the road, or, you know, something like that. So I feel like with comment letters, you know, we'll talk about do's and don'ts, but it's really a place to be creative and identify all the issues that you see with these things. And as Mindy pointed out, you know, try your best to put them in terms of environmental impacts as opposed to economic ones. But, you know, there's really no, you know, wrong impact to identify.
Cool. And cool. So yeah, and it looks like we have a good mix based on the poll of people who have and haven't commented on EIR before. although I would not have guessed that the majority goes to people who have not commented on EIR. But yeah, so for those who have commented on an EIR before, how did you decide what topics to include in your comments? What was it, something that came up when you were looking at the documents, or maybe things that had come up in the community, word of mouth, or if maybe somebody else brought up comments that prompted you to get some responses in chat?
And folks can also raise their hand if they want to just say it instead of type it.
Jonathan, do you want to?
Yeah, my area that I'm really good at is air quality, and I think air quality is I've been able to do it over times and time, and so I've been able to do it pretty easy to where I look at it, I go straight to air quality. Everything else I try my best, but that's how everyone works. I think over time, as people are reading these things, they're going to start pinpointing specific topics they're interested in.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it depends on whether a residential development or industrial. Cool.
I also
yeah,
saw a
and-
comment, I'm sorry, Mindy, I also saw a comment in there from Mary Elizabeth that said that she looks at the summary of impacts and mitigation measures as well.
Yes. Yes, definitely. And we'll pinpoint, Carmen kind of alluded to them earlier, but we'll definitely kind of highlight different things in an EIR that kind of can help set the stage for what to look for further in terms of impacts. Yeah, significant impacts on mitigation. Yes, usually, sorry, I don't know if this might be repeating something from later on, but often EIRs will have an executive summary portion, and sometimes those summaries will have a giant table basically of all of the impacts and whether or not the agency found that those impacts were significant. If they were significant, if mitigation could be used to reduce them to less than significant and kind of help resolve those impacts basically. And so that's a good place to look first to see if there are any impacts that the agency said were significant, but then they didn't identify any mitigation to address them. Cool.
All right, so we're coming to our first great breakout group exercise, and this sounds a little bit similar to the to one of the questions Mindy asked before, but we're going to take it a step further into this concept of what are significant environmental impacts. So the question for you when you go into your breakout groups is to think about, there's a new rail yard that's proposed across the street from a residential neighborhood. So first question is, what are some of the impacts that the rail yard could have? And we just went through that Appendix G list of all the various things, and you all came up with good ideas. And then, but the second question, to take it a little bit further, is just when should those impacts be considered significant? So once you think of the kind of impacts that the project could have, we want you to think about, okay, and how would you show that those impacts are significant? What sort of metric would you use? What sort of rule would you use for determining whether they're significant? And I think we're going to spend about 5 minutes on this. So once you get transferred over into your groups and settled in, you should just go ahead and get started. And then when we come back, we'll chat and see what you came up with. Better.
I think everybody's back.
Great. All right. So before we move on, we'd like to hear a little bit about what the group's thoughts were, what impacts you thought of, and even more importantly, how would you decide whether those impacts were significant or not? Anyone want to volunteer for their group? Share some ideas?
So, for me,
So I think the list that we have is super significant for the simple fact, I don't know how many of you do, but I know several people that have train track. And I'm already a mile away from Amtrak and I can still hear it when it blows its whistle. But you know, to put a train again in South Stockton around residential is probably, you know, I don't know whose idea that was. If it's Union Pacific, but it's probably one of the most stupidest suggestions that they could suggest for our city.
This isn't a real project. I don't want to get you worried.
Okay.
That was my stupid idea of a
Oh,
bad
okay.
project.
No, but it was a good it was a good exercise. But if we had actually proposed it, you knew it was coming down the, you know, the pipeline, boy, you know, you got to have some picketers out there for that one. We already got too many trains down here.
And you know what? Pat brought up a great point. And I don't know if this is ever considered in CEQA, the idea of cumulative impacts. And that's something we're working on now, that putting a rail yard where there was no rail yard and there are no rail yards in that community, is that different than putting a rail yard where there are already existing rail yards that are causing a lot of environmental damage? You know, like, can that be considered in CEQA, like what is already there?
Right.
Yeah.
And prime example is down here by El Dorado and McKinley. If you know the area I'm talking about, where they put in that new intersection for truck drivers coming off of Industrial on the McKinley, or I think it is McKinley down that side. Is that it has tracks already. It is industrial, but we're trying to encourage building houses down here, you know? And so if we're trying to get affordable housing down here, we sure don't want to be sitting up there looking at another train yard. We're already dealing with tractor yards or big rig yards. You know, we sure don't need no train yards down here.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just do a quick response on the cumulative impacts. Yes, that is a special kind of impact that you're required to consider in an EIR. And I think of it as like, I mean, there are different ways of having cumulative impacts. One is like, you know, if you're saying, oh, it's just one little rail yard, how is that going to matter? But it's like an addition on top of, you know, there are 10 other ones here, and what are all the impacts together going to be like? And sometimes I think of it as like, is this project going to be the straw that broke the camel's back sort of thing? Like maybe everything is just like barely okay at the moment. You add one project, which might not be that significant on its own, but because it's going to coexist with all these other projects, the impacts altogether are going to be significant. So, so yeah, it's definitely a CEQA concept. Jonathan, I see your hand up.
I know we have to move on, but one question I think we had for clarification was, you know, when should those impacts be considered significant? What does that mean?
Oh, were you just teeing up my next slide?
No, yeah, maybe. let's do it.
All right. Okay, so how do you tell if an impact is significant? And this is another one of those special CEQA terms. There's something called a threshold of significance. And so when you look at an EIR, and we're going to have a little sample later on of a little piece of analysis in an EIR, usually sort of there will be an impact area. So let's say we're talking about noise, right? How will this new rail yard have a significant noise impact on the community? And then in order to answer that question, you kind of need to know, like, well, what would significant be? Would it be creating any noise? Would it be blasting horns 24/7? Like, you need some sort of standard to say, okay, if it does X thing with respect to noise, it's going to be a significant impact. And so here's the definition of a threshold of significance. It's an established level where an impact is considered significant. And so really for each piece of the analysis, you should see in an EIR that the lead agency has said, okay, if this project increases the ambient noise level by 3 decibels, then we're going to call it a significant impact. And one thing we just wanted to point out is sometimes they get it wrong, like what the threshold of significance should be. And if you think that they've set something like, let's say they said, if this project increases the noise level by 100 decibels, which is like a huge leap of noise, only then will it be significant. You could be like, no, that threshold doesn't make any sense, because we're going to be like, the neighbors will be experiencing adverse effects at just 3 decibels or something like that. I picked kind of a technical one, but you can imagine there are similar thresholds for other impact areas. So for aesthetics, is it going to be on a scenic corridor? Is it going to, you know, block a view of something that the community thinks is, you know, an aesthetic resource? So I see a couple hands raised. Mary Elizabeth and then Margot. You're muted, Mary Elizabeth.
All right, just on that noise one. So you say if it was 3 decibels, how would the community know, you know, what is the, you know, the existing noise level, you know, that this is going to add to? You know, you know, you can just look at one single piece of equipment, right, and then maybe multiply that out, but that seems like it almost would need a specialized study.
Well, and that information should be in the EIR. So if there's no information about that in sort of like the existing setting portion of the EIR, you should ask for it and say, how am I supposed to know if this is going to be too noisy or not? I don't know what the existing noise levels are. So that's one thing to look for, and we'll get into sort of existing setting later. But I think you do raise a good point of you know, the role of like technical experts here, and how you, as a not assuming you're not a noise expert, how you review these documents. And part of it is asking for more information so that the lead agency will provide it to you. And then you can take a look and see, well, does this make sense? You know, if you're looking just as a normal person, if you're looking at the map where they took the noise measurements, for example, and you're like, well, actually, you know, why didn't you take a noise measurement from here, which is a daycare, which is especially sensitive and has nap times or whatever? You can kind of just use your critical thinking skills to look at what's there and ask for more information if it hasn't been provided.
Thanks.
Yeah, Margot, did you have a question or a comment?
I think I had a similar question, but so it's an established level where an impact is considered significant. So it's established somewhere. Where would we find it if we needed? Say, yeah, they're supposed to put it in the EIR, but what if we go, oh, that's got to be all wrong? Where would we find reality?
Well, I will say, you know, one thing that I often do is I just say, Google is my friend. And I say, well, who else might have been thinking about this? And are there other lead agencies, maybe lead agencies in jurisdictions where they might be more environmentally friendly, for example, or have communities that have, you know, insisted on more disclosure or have been through similar projects? Let me see if I can find an EIR or a negative declaration or something that I can look to see if they maybe have a different threshold of significance. So that's what I would do. I saw a question in the chat, but I also saw Karen's hand up. So maybe Karen first, and then we can go to the chat question.
Yeah, I worked at a place that was expanding. They were an automobile manufacturer. And so they were expanding into a new building. They were bringing in 6 rail line, you know, so they could load the rail cars to ship the cars. And then they were bringing in multiple car carriers to load and take to dealerships. And so one of the mitigating measures was a big berm around the fencing so you couldn't see it. And I thought that was interesting, you know, that's how they mitigated a lot of the noise and the, you know, the aesthetics that you talked about was just building a berm. But one of the things they asked for is that there was to be vegetation kept on that berm, as you can imagine why, so it doesn't
Yeah.
blow away. And yet, you know, that got lost in the translation and nobody knew that. I found it years later when I became the environmental engineer, and I was like, you let the vegetation die. Yeah, we didn't want to water it. And, you know, it was growing weeds and the weeds were fine.
Yeah.
But they didn't want to, they decided to cut corners in their budget. And I was like, that kind of stuff happens, you know? So
yeah,
what
that
do you do
raises
going
so many
back?
good points. One is you always want to make sure, especially with vegetation, that at the outset, when the mitigation measure is getting developed, that you have some sort of monitoring and performance criteria for down the road. So what I mean by that is, don't just say, you know, plant these specific plants here on the berm, but say, and every year you have to report to the city on whether at least 85% of the plants are still alive. And if they're not, you have to replant and report back, or make sure that you either have irrigation as part of it or you have drought tolerant plants. So I think thinking about how these measures are going to last into the future is really important, and getting as much as you can up front in the initial mitigation measures is key. And I think the other point, and then we'll move on to the question in the chat, but that you raise is just like, what happens if the lead agency drops the ball in the future? Like, you've got these great mitigation measures, but no one's doing anything about it. And that one is very challenging because basically the lead agency is kind of the only entity that's really charged with making sure that that happens. I have never been involved in or known of any lawsuit like arguing that a city has dropped the ball on that and needs to do better. So again, like, keep that in mind. Like, you want to be sort of, when I comment on mitigation or think about developing mitigation, I always want to think about, like, how can I structure this so that we don't have to rely on a ton of future enforcement by a city, which maybe doesn't have the resources or forgets about, you know, things. There are some agencies that are very good about it and keep track of all the mitigation and have follow-up. And there is something that's called a mitigation monitoring and reporting plan that comes with an EIR that says, here's the mitigation, here's who's responsible for doing what and when. And so if you can get your hands on that and wave it around and go into, you know, whoever at the city or county that's responsible for enforcing the mitigation and say, have you done these things? That might be effective as well. I haven't ever tried it, but it might be effective.
Right, and Winter, I think, yeah, just after we, there's a question in the chat, and I think maybe we should move on from there to get through the rest of the program here.
Okay. So question is, how do you deal with 4 years of construction, cutting and leveling hills, moving dirt and building supportive areas for moved dirt next to a neighborhood? The rules only seem to cover the noise and dust and GHGs after the project is finished, not during construction. This is a great point, because an EIR should consider, and usually does consider, both construction and what they call operational impacts. So impacts that could come from the actual construction of the project, and then impacts that come later. So if you see in an EIR that they haven't analyzed those, definitely comment on it. That is a big missing piece. All right, Scott, I think we're ready for the next slide.
Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about actually diving into the usually very thick EIR. Where do you start? What do you look for? We've already kind of touched on some of these things, but let's talk about that a little bit more. Next slide. So first, what's the purpose of doing this review and commenting on CEQA documents? You could have multiple purposes or just one of these, but one purpose would be political, where you might be trying to convince decision makers that the project shouldn't be approved. It could be practical, So you might want to be convincing the decision makers or the applicant themselves that you want them to make changes to the project or include additional measures to minimize the negative impacts. So you might be pushing them to consider a smaller project, for example, or you might be wanting to bring litigation about this project, or if not you yourself, maybe you know that there's some groups out there that are organizing to potentially litigate. And there you want to bring up everything that is wrong with the document. That's called creating a record or an administrative record that will allow you or someone else to bring a potentially successful lawsuit challenging the project. So when a project is litigated, when there's a lawsuit, the attorneys can only use the information that has been submitted into the record through comments or submittal of, as attachments to the submittal of comments. So that's a pretty important thing if you are looking at that step. Next slide. One of the main things to think about when you first start reviewing an EIR is, do you think the agency used the appropriate document to do the CEQA review? Remember, we talked about the smaller document, which is a mitigated negative declaration or a negative declaration, and then the more involved one, which is an EIR. Sometimes they try to do an exemption and you have to argue that, no, this project's not exempt. But more often you see a project using a mitigated negative declaration, you really have to ask yourself, are they really providing enough information to rely on a mitigated neg deck? And are they mitigating all of the potentially significant impacts to a less than significant level? Or is it possible that some of the impacts will remain significant even after they apply mitigation? If even one of them does, then they have to do an EIR. If it's only one or two impacts, then they can do something called the focused EIR, where they only look at those potential impacts that could be significant, but they still have to do an EIR. Okay, next slide. And now it's Mindy's turn.
Well, thanks. And so just as a quick reminder, these are the EIR sections that we're going to cover in more detail tonight. But again, this is definitely not everything that's in an EIR. And however, if you're looking for a place to start, these are usually good places to do so. And in terms of the impact analysis, you certainly don't have to look at all of the different impacts. As Jonathan mentioned, you can, focus on the ones that interest you, that you're most comfortable with, that you're most concerned about, whatever kind of draws your attention for any project or EIR. All of the points, even though we're going to be focusing on kind of specific sections, all of the things, the talking points that we have, the advice that we're going to give are usually very applicable to all different kinds of impacts, including the tribal and cultural resource impacts that a project might have. And as Scott mentioned at the beginning, he'll be sending around some additional resources as a follow-up related specifically to tribal and cultural resources.
And Mindy, I'm going to suggest that we do, I'm just looking at the time here, and if we can kind of do the next few slides as sort of like lightning round, we're going to go into some more detail and questions you should ask yourself as you're reviewing each of these sections. But hopefully you all have this as a resource, these questions that we have here, and we also provided some specific like starter language for comments for each of these things. So I'm hoping we can kind of just jog our way through this because we have a couple more breakout sessions, which I think are probably the most fun and interesting.
Yes, definitely. So this is a great thing to start off with because project description is exactly what it sounds like. So this section needs to describe the project. It should do so, to give everybody a good sense of what the project looks like, what it's going to entail, if there are any laws that apply to the project. things like that. Usually the project description kind of shapes and sets the tone for whether the impacts analysis is accurate. So if the project description doesn't cover the whole project or is missing some key parts of the project, that's usually a good clue that the impacts analysis might be missing those same things too. And yeah, so things to look out for, like I mentioned, whether the project description actually covers the whole project. If the project is going to lead to future phases, the project description should cover that. If you know that this development, for example, is part of a bigger group of things going on, then that's something to clue into too. And maybe this description should describe the whole project and not just one small piece or segment of it. So yeah. We can move on. Cool.
Okay, so environmental setting, I think we touched on this a little bit. This is where the EIR has to describe the existing environmental condition. And it's especially important because under CEQA, it forms the environmental baseline for how much, for determining how much and in what way the project will change the existing conditions. So you want to know, for example, somebody earlier said, well, what if you already have a really noisy environment? You know, maybe if it's already super noisy, you don't have to add that much for an impact to be significant. So knowing where you're starting is really important. They should describe existing conditions for water quality, for air quality, and, you know, if you already have a really polluted waterway, any increment of added pollutants should be considered significant. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so now this is the big meaty section, right? This is the impact analysis. Regardless of what impact section you're looking at, what topic, you want to look for these things. The EIR has to describe how the project will affect the existing environment from the baseline condition. It has to explain how it reached its conclusion about whether an impact is significant or not. They can't just say it's not going to have a significant impact. They have to have evidence. They have to explain how they reached their conclusion about whether the impact will be significant. They have to provide supporting evidence for all of their conclusions, and they have to clearly state if the impact will be significant. Evidence can be anything from, for example, field studies or a citation to a publication. It has to be based on facts and reasonable assumptions, so they can't speculate or just give their opinion that it's not going to be significant. They also have to tell you, they have to provide sufficient detail so that you can understand what the severity and the extent of the impact is. So it's not enough to say, oh, this railroad's going to be really loud and it's going to be an impact on the neighboring community. Well, how loud? And for how long? What are the hours? Is it going to conflict with a local noise ordinance? They have to provide enough detail to where you can make sense of it. And if they don't, you can say, you know, you're not really providing enough information. They can't use an overly restricted geographical study. And you see this sometimes, you know, like they set a boundary for where their environmental geographical area is going to be. Well, a lot of impacts spill over. If you have a really brightly lit site, it's going to spill over to whoever's nearby. If you have air pollutants, they don't stay within a property line. Same with noise, same with water quality, you know, water, surface water and groundwater travels off site. Like Mindy said, they can't defer analysis or piecemeal their analysis. So sometimes you'll see mitigation measures that say, we'll do an evaluation prior to getting that permit. No, the evaluation has to be done here because the public needs to know about it. And same for mitigation measures. They can't say, we'll figure out what mitigations we need later. They have to disclose those to the public now. Cumulative impacts, Winter already touched on a little bit. And you know, what you see in a lot of EIRs is they'll say, they'll have all the project level impacts, and then they get to the cumulative impact and they repeat what they said for the project. And they don't really do a cumulative impact analysis. So they're supposed to do two things for a cumulative impact analysis. One, talk about what the combined impacts are going to be of this project along with all the others that they should know about or they know are going to be coming down the pipe. And then after they discuss the cumulative impacts, they need to talk about whether the impacts from this project are considered cumulatively considerable. And that means, well, okay, you know, there's going to be a cumulative impact together. It's going to look like this. But if you look at what this project is contributing, it's a pretty small amount. So it's not cumulatively considerable. It's possible that you'll see that. And
Carmen, but before we move on, there were a couple of quick questions in the chat. I'd like
sorry.
to that's okay. So
Yeah.
one question is there a standard or state list of exemptions like the sports stadium you mentioned earlier?
Yes.
That's one of the questions.
Yes. So CEQA is the statute or the law itself. And then there's also a document called the CEQA guidelines, which are official guidelines that go with the CEQA law. And in those guidelines, those you can find online if you Google CEQA guidelines. And in there, you will see a section on exemptions. And there's different types of exemptions. There's like a long list of them. So for example, one of them says, if you're replacing or repairing existing infrastructure that got damaged, that's usually exempt unless they're trying to expand that infrastructure. So yeah, thank you. Brian just put a link to the CEQA guidelines in the chat box, and OPR stands for the California Office of Planning and Research. And they have an online copy that is searchable. It's great, very easy. What if there is another project approved but not yet built? Very good question. That should be in the list of cumulative projects as well. So the way CEQA defines cumulative projects is that you include anything that has recently been approved, whether it's been built or not, like if it's new, the project, you know, whether it's currently being built or if they've already put in an application for a project that hasn't yet been approved, but you can anticipate that it's in the pipeline, so it's probably, or it could happen. Okay, Winter, I think we're on to you.
All right, we're up to mitigation, which is my personal favorite. So we've talked about this before. Mitigation, just very briefly, is steps or measures that the applicant, the project developer, can take to reduce significant impacts. So like when, I don't remember if it was Margot or someone else who mentioned the berm, like, okay, this project is going to have significant noise impacts, significant aesthetic impacts. Mitigation measure could be build a berm around it so that that would reduce, you wouldn't see it anymore. So it would reduce aesthetic impacts, and it would block some of the noise. So it would reduce noise impacts as well. So what do you want to look out for mitigation measures? First, you want to look out to see, okay, if the EIR is saying there's going to be this big noise impact, we're going to do this mitigation measure. Now it's going to be a less than significant noise impact. You want to look and see, like, does that really ring true? Is this one measure or two measures? Have they explained how those measures are actually going to reduce the impact to something that's not significant? So that's one. And this one, again, will kind of get you back to those thresholds of significance that we talked about, right? So if the threshold is will the project increase ambient noise by 3 decibels? And they say, well, we're going to use this mitigation measure that, you know, we did studies, we know that mitigation measure is going to reduce the noise to only a 2 decibel increase. Well, then they might have shown that the measure will actually do its job. So that's one thing to look out for. And then the other, again, if the measure, if the EIR says, oh, well, we'll do something in the future. So we'll approve this project now, and then we want you to come up with a plan to reduce impacts in the future. No, the public should be informed of what the mitigation measure is now so that you can comment on it and say whether it is going to be effective or not. And also because it's going to be too late after the project is approved, what are you going to do if the mitigation measure turns out not to be effective? So always insist on having the measures now. And then also always look out for like squishy language. Like if they say, well, just like try to reduce this as much as possible or as much as feasible, or we're going to make you plant as many trees as are feasible or economically possible. No, you just need the number. Just tell me how many trees you're going to plant. Tell me, you know, exactly what you are going to require this applicant to do so that we can understand what's being required, what will actually happen, and how much it will reduce the impacts. So next slide, this will get us to our next breakout group. Which we have a 2-slide lead up here. But basically, this is going to be looking at an air quality mitigation measure to see in your groups whether you can, whether you're satisfied with the mitigation measure or you think there are comments to be made. So I think Jonathan volunteered as one of the many air quality experts here, since we have CARB folks as well. So you'll be lucky if you have Jonathan in your group. So I'm going to read through this slide and the next slide, and then you'll go into your groups. And I think we were going to either put this language in the chat or maybe it was in the handout. So hopefully we'll be able to get you this. You won't have to just remember it.
And Winter, just so you know, the next slide, which is the bulk of the text, I have sent as a standalone slide for all the room facilitators, so they can either post the information in chat or they can share screen once they get in their room. So there's a few different options of ways that folks might be able to see it.
All right, great. So this is from, I don't know, if for folks who were on the last workshop, attended the last workshop, we kind of used the South Stockton Commerce Center EIR as for some samples of what you might see in an EIR. And here, this is in the air quality impact analysis. And so this impact, which you'll see, it kind of incorporates the threshold of significance, says proposed project operation would result in a cumulatively considerable net increase of any criteria pollutant for which the project region is in non-attainment, or conflict or obstruct implementation of the district's, this is the air pollution control district's air quality plan. So putting this, translating this into plain English, which the EIR should have done, this impact is saying, yeah, this project could increase air pollution in the region, and it's the kind of air pollution that we already have a lot of around. That's what it means, the region's in non-attainment for this kind of air pollution. Or it could conflict with the air pollution control district's plan to improve air quality. So that's the impact that we're dealing with. And then the next slide is going to be the mitigation that is proposed.
Oh,
and I realized,
can I ask a quick question? The way that was written, does an area being in non-attainment immediately trigger something? Because it seemed like the way it was written that maybe it did, or does the attainment status of an area matter, or does it trigger that, like, certain mitigations have to happen, you know?
It's almost always, from a CEQA perspective, it's almost always the thresholds that the lead agency uses. So if you're in non-attainment and a project is going to increase pollution, and non-attainment, just to take a quick step back, make it a little bit simpler, and CARB folks, you can jump in as the real experts here in this, but there are regulations at the national level and at the state level for what air quality the Environmental Protection Agency and our state believes is kind of necessary for public health. And so we say, you know, there should only be this much ozone or this much particulate matter, or, you know, there are basically 6 different main common air pollutants. And if a region has more than that, so if the Stockton area has more than that limit, then it's considered in non-attainment, and the regional air quality control districts or air pollution control districts, they need to like have a plan for how they're going to get the air below those limits to be healthy for the human beings who live there. And so usually you'll see this is very common in EIRs where you'll say, okay, this region is in non-attainment. That means it has bad too much of a certain kind of pollution. And so if this new project is going to add more of that pollution, that's typically considered a significant impact. So it's not required. It's just, I think if you saw somebody, if you saw an EIR that said, no big deal, it's, you know, going to add this type of pollution, that would be a good comment to make, that they really need to have a threshold that prevents that, or that says that that increase is going to be significant. Okay, so this one has a lot of words and I'm going to try and get through it. I've highlighted some phrases that might ring a bell since we were just talking about mitigation measures and what you should be on the lookout for. Make sure they don't have squishy language. Make sure you know exactly what is going to be required. Jonathan, did you have a question?
I was going to say maybe we should just read it on through the group. I don't know if that's going to take some time.
Okay, well, we can do that as well. I don't need to read it out loud, but I would say when you read it through as a group, one thing you might want to do is just catch some of the words and phrases that you don't know what they mean and talk about them. And again, with this, I will say Google is your friend. So if you're doing this not in a group, you're doing it on your own, and you get to, you know, Rule 9510, for example, which is in here. And you're like, what's Rule 9510? Google it. That's what I did. And you find out what it is. So I'm happy to let people read it on their own or go in, read it out loud in their breakout groups too.
I guess my only question would be, just since you actually do know some of the plain language translation, I think there might be some value for kind of hearing your thoughts and weighing in on what some of the language means. So Jonathan, not to discount your,
Yeah, no, totally.
I'm all about the time, but I think there is some value in helping folks understand plain language.
Okay, well, I'll read it through. I love reading out loud, so that's fine with me. My kid doesn't let me do it anymore. And then the goal of the breakout group is going to be to talk about this mitigation measure and see if what kind of comments you might have if you were commenting on this. So again, we're dealing with a project that's going to increase air pollution in an area that already has a lot of that pollution. And here's what they're proposing for mitigation. Prior to the approval of individual phases of development, for example, final maps, improvement plans, site plan review, these are all different steps in the approval process for this particular commerce center. Each project applicant shall coordinate with the SJVA PCD, that's the Air Pollution Control District, to ensure compliance with Rule 9510 for both operational and construction emissions. The intent is that each phase of development would demonstrate that the individual project does not exceed the applicable air district criteria, pollutant thresholds for project operations or construction. If the air district criteria pollutant thresholds for an individual project is exceeded, the project applicant shall develop a reasonably feasible off-site mitigation strategy to reduce long-term air quality impacts to below the applicable air district thresholds of significance. This may consist of fee payments to the air district for their use in funding off-site mitigation strategies. Each off-site mitigation strategy shall be developed with and approved by the air district and the city of Stockton. Each off-site mitigation strategy is subject to the review and approval of the air district and the city of Stockton on a project-by-project basis, and is intended to be in addition to offsets that are obtained through any on-site mitigation measures. The city is required to verify each off-site mitigation strategy and its associated reductions to ensure that the associated air quality impacts are reduced to the maximum extent feasible, i.e. to below the applicable air district thresholds of significance at minimum. Examples of off-site mitigation strategies may include, but are not limited to, transportation demand management measures and/or financial incentives for project employees to utilize alternative transportation options such as buses, bicycles, or electric vehicles. So this is a very jargony mitigation measure, but I'll just comment on a couple of these terms because I was noticing as I was reading, there was the concept of, okay, there's this air district out there that has some rules for reducing air pollution. And so, you know, this is this rule 9510. And so the mitigation measure seems to be saying, you know, we're going to try, we want you, the mitigation for this air pollution impact is going to be to comply with this other agency's rule 9510. We have the concept of both operational and construction emissions, which we talked about before, like what's the air pollution coming from construction of the project, and then what's going to be the air pollution coming once the project is built. And then we also have this concept like, we don't really know what you're going to do in order to mitigate these impacts. That's going to come in the future. We're just saying you have to comply with these rules and develop a reasonably feasible mitigation strategy at some point in the future. The other couple of concepts I saw in here was a difference between on-site and off-site mitigation. So what that basically means is there are certain things you can do on the project site, like you could put in solar panels on the building, or you could have electric vehicle charging stations, or you could, you know, not use natural gas, you could use electricity. That would all be on-site mitigation. And then there's this other concept of off-site mitigation. So pay into a fund and have the air district do something on another location. So you have to kind of think of like, well, is that going to help the community right around this facility or not? And let's see, oops, lost my page. Were there any, oh, and then there's this concept of a transportation demand management measure at the very end. This is one of the strategies that they might use to reduce project impacts. And that usually means like come up with a plan to lower the number of vehicle trips you're going to get, the number of cars, either from workers or from the facility itself or from people who are visiting it. So that's the measure. I'm sure you all have lots of questions. I think I'm happy to, I think maybe if you go into your breakout groups, since you all have kind of people in there with some knowledge, that would be good. You can ask your questions in there. And then we can come back, and if there are still questions, we can talk about it, or we can just hear your thoughts on whether you think this is really going to achieve, this mitigation measure is really going to reduce the project's impacts the way it's supposed to.
Are there any questions about the exercise or what you're doing in your breakout room before we have Michelle start sending you out?
Right. Welcome back to the big group. I see Jonathan already has his hand raised, ready to tell us what his group talked about. Did you think that that mitigation measure was sufficient? And if not, what were your questions or complaints?
Yeah, the group came up with some really good questions and some thoughts. One of them was, you know, the overall, the whole thing is squishy language. You know, what one person thinks is reasonably feasible might not be reasonably feasible amongst other folks. And so what's the precedent? You know, where is the language that clearly shows what is considered reasonably feasible? The other thing is, one point that was brought up was the fact that, you know, all of these regulations are averages through an algorithm. Not every algorithm works with each community. For me, I think that, you know, it brings up a good point in that, unfortunately, because of us having such a huge blockage of data collection, we have to base things on averages. But I think the residents are starting to think, you know, why is that community doing that when clearly that community is well off, better than this community? We need more protections on this side, but given the average, whatever it is, it allows it to get passed. I think that's something that isn't really laid out here in the documents, but it's just an overall sort of a macro level sort of thing.
Right, and I
Great.
think Isaac actually used the same phrase as far as squishy language in our group, you know, and we came up with some of the same things that Jonathan came up with, you know, when the reasonably feasible, you know, was bolded for a reason. I think it just stood out, you know, reasonably feasible to who? To the builders, to the people that live in the community. What's reasonable to one group that have, you know, that stand to gain financially may not be reasonably feasible to the people that have to live and endure this building, the pollution source being there. So that right there wasn't very clear. And then again, you know, nothing concrete as far as mitigation efforts. We may do this, we may do that. We'll probably get approval in the future, but there's nothing there concrete that, you know, would allow the public to know what's going on, and especially to object to whatever they have in place. So there's nothing there that they can object to because there's nothing clear. And I think it's just a way to kind of, you know, hide the ball and really seem like they're doing something, but there's actually nothing in place there. It's a shell game.
Yeah, I love all those comments. And one thing I frequently put in my comments is, why can't you just say what the measures are now? Like, why do you have to wait to do it later? Like, just pick the measures so we can comment on them instead of having this long drawn out process. So all excellent points. And I see some comments in the chat about like how far off site can mitigation measures be. And Mary Elizabeth says, I think the air district does the offsite, the district bound as within the district boundary. Okay, but let's make them tell us about it. I also think, why do I have to Google Rule 9510? You tell me what that requires. That's the job of the EIR. So, so yeah, I think this sort of, you know, in terms of the comments you can make, there's the give me more information, there's the clarify the mitigation measures, and there's the do it now, kind of all of those things come together.
Well, if I can chime in with one more thing, there's no reason why you would all know this, but just so you do know it, there's a lot of case law under CEQA that says complying with existing laws in place alone is not enough. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because if all we had to do is comply with the law, then we don't need CEQA. We just need enforcement. So that's not enough. They need to show that compliance will actually reduce the impacts, and how.
Yeah, great point. Mary Elizabeth, I see your hand up. Oh, you're muted though.
Sorry, so this one here also has taken the power from the people by putting it on San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District and the city. So they're deciding what they think is enough, and that's wrong.
Yeah, and they're doing it after the project approval, right? So kind of too late at that point. All right, any more thoughts on on this exercise. We're getting close to the 7 o'clock hour and we have a few more slides to cover here, so. All right. Okay, so now heading into our last section. We've already been talking about this, how to do effective commenting, but we're going to get a little bit more into detail here. And again, you know, as we talked about before, comments serve a few different purposes. You know, there's like the political, the practical, and the litigation purpose. So keep that in mind. And then we're going to head into some more tips for making your comments effective.
Just to go over this quickly, these are kind of some options where you might comment. So any time during the preparation of an EIR or an environmental review document is fair game. A quick thing to just note is that if you want to file a lawsuit challenging the project under CEQA, there's an exhaustion of administrative remedies requirement. And so that just requires two things. One is that at some point during the process, you commented on the project and you participated in that process. And then two is that at some point, someone raised the issues that you want to bring in your lawsuit. So you don't have to have been the one to do that, as long as you participated and someone, it could have been you, but someone at some point raised those issues.
All right, so, and this one I think we had in the last meeting or the last workshop as well. Here are some helpful topics. One is personal experience and observations and storytelling. So even though EIRs are full of technical language, if you know that, for example, that the EIR is missing some information because you live in the community and you've seen resources or you've experienced the air quality or whatever, that's really helpful to put in there, and that counts as evidence. Errors and omissions in the existing setting discussion, we talked about that. So like if they forget or don't state that there's a wetlands over, you know, next to the project or on the project site, and you know about it because you've walked in the area, that's a helpful topic. Incomplete project description, analysis is deferred, just meaning like, you know, some of this language we saw where it says, oh yeah, there will be an impact, but we'll just, our mitigation will be just like study that impact in the future and come up with something in the future to fix it. That's not okay, and that's a good thing to comment on. Mitigation measures, as we just discussed in our breakout groups, and then alternatives, which we didn't talk about too much in this session, but in an EIR, like we mentioned at the beginning, they're supposed to consider alternatives to the project. So if you have something that seems to tick all the boxes of the project objectives, it's still a mall, or it's still a warehouse, or it's still an office building, but you have an idea about how to do that project. Maybe it's a little bit different, maybe it's a little smaller, maybe the building design is different in a way that would reduce impacts. That's called a project alternative, and you can also suggest that in your comments.
And Winter, I guess for the purpose of the folks maybe watching the video that can't see the chat, just wanted to point out that Jonathan asked the question that, so for a potential lawsuit, if we just have comment letters in any of these points, then it's fair game. He said opportunities, not points. Mindy responded, correct, any of these issues raised in those comment letters on the project can be raised in a CEQA lawsuit against the project. So I just want to make sure that for the benefit of those seeing the video, that that was a good comment.
Yeah, and Mindy and Jonathan make the good point also that we recommend written comments. It's a lot easier to find them again in the record, but you can also just get up and speak, right? Put in your speaker card and make your comments verbally. at a public hearing. So that's another completely acceptable way to make your public comments. And I think in your next workshop, you'll probably talk more about political strategies and getting people, and we actually did a little exercise with this in the last workshop too, of watching some verbal comments and seeing, okay, how could we get together a group and all wear matching t-shirts in order to make our voice even more powerful in that arena. So tips for effective comments. Here's the list of do's. Do use a professional tone. Put comments in writing. Again, you can also do verbal comments, but we recommend putting it in writing. Focus on the adequacy of the document. So all these things we've been going over. Is the project description okay? Environmental setting. What about the mitigation measures? And if you can, if you have some outside sources, some material, articles or other letters, or like you're Googling, like we were talking about, like, oh, I Googled and I found that this EIR in this other town used a different methodology or threshold of significance. Put that in, put it in your comment, or at least an excerpt of it, or a website link to it. So that's all in the record. Those are all the do's. Do not be disrespectful or rude. I wouldn't expect any of you to do that. And this one is big. This is what you see a lot of, is comments that are basically just saying, we don't like the project. That one will get you when they do the response to comments. They'll say, thank you very much. That's not an environmental, that's not a CEQA comment. So we don't have to say anything in response. So really you want to tie all of your comments to one of the CEQA requirements, whether that's an adequate disclosure of what the project is, what it will do, the mitigation measures or alternatives. Also, another don't is to disagree with data or evidence without having something else to point to. So if you just say, I don't believe your numbers on this spreadsheet, it's not going to get you very far. But it is okay to say, this looks suspicious. Like, there are a bunch of zeros in this column. Like, did something go funny with that traffic study or whatever? So if something in their data looks weird, definitely ask the question and point it out and see what you get in response. And also don't comment solely on the economic impacts of the project. This was Mindy's point before. CEQA doesn't, unless it's connected to the environment, just saying this is gonna reduce my property value. That's a very common one, right? It's gonna be next to my house, it'll reduce my property value. That will also get you a comment noted, but no real response. And also, you want to make appear reasonable in your demands. So if you say you should have looked at 12 different alternatives, or if you just say don't allow any development on that site, you're gonna kind of get a like, well, we don't have to do, we just have to do a reasonable range of alternatives, and we can't prohibit all development. There's somebody who owns the site, things like that. All right, so we had another breakout group that we were hoping to do, but you guys, we had so much to say and it was such an active participation. We're not going to be able to do it, but it's in your materials. So if you want extra credit, you can look at your extra handout. But we do have 6 minutes left. So if folks have questions or thoughts or reflections or comments on the presentation, we're happy to answer anything we can.
Oh, I just had a question too. Something that we learned, especially when we did the big California scoping plan that we had a few months ago in downtown Sacramento, that you have to make sure that when you do have give a public comment, that you allow for the time that they're going to be given. And sometimes, especially with that, they had a huge ton of people that were lined up for public comments. I think it was like over 400. So they cut down the time significantly. Everyone was given just a minute. So to make the changes, to make sure that you hit the points that you want to hit, because that minute goes by really, really fast. 3 minutes right there is fast. It gets you down. You can, get out 1 or 2 good points that you want, but 1 minute, you have to make sure that you really cut down your comments so that you can actually have something to say, and they don't cut you off mid-sentence before you even say anything that you want to say. So I think timing it down, and especially knowing how many people are there, is really going to affect your public comment and what you're able to say.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and a couple of thoughts on it. Sometimes I'll have like 2 versions of my comments if it seems like that might be a possibility. So you have like the long 3-minute version and then the shorter 1-minute version. That's really just bullet points. The other thing is if you're doing this with a group, of course you can coordinate. So you might cover air quality and Jonathan might cover water quality, so that you don't have to, everyone has to say the same thing. And then the last strategy that sometimes works, usually not when it's like 1 million people who all want to comment, but if it's kind of a smaller setting, and if you have a friendly president of the board or mayor or whatever, is to ask to have people sort of put their time together, so that you would have one representative speaker get like 5 minutes or 6 minutes. You'd say, I have 6 people who are all donating their time so that Hector can speak for 6 minutes. But you want to make sure that that's going to fly. So talk to like the clerk or the whoever is in charge of the scheduling and timing before you make plans for that. I see Karen's hand up.
Yeah, I kind of have 2 questions. So recently, last week, I was at a meeting and there was a project where they're tearing down existing building and building a whole new, tearing down residential and putting in business. And one of the comments made was that they didn't think that the public comment, the way that the city was informing the public, wasn't adequate. And they kind of just went, well, we did this, and they moved on. So that's one. And the other thing is, I was in another project where it was a disadvantaged community. And when I asked him to see what they had gotten from the city for public comments, it was very technical and it was just nothing. I mean, you could have easily said, we're going to be building a warehouse that's going to have thousands of trucks every day in your neighborhood. But no, it's very, just like that example you gave, And so our comment was, you need to send out the public comment outreach again, because, first of all, you only did it in one language, and this community is primarily English is their second language or not spoken at all, and you only sent out in English. And the other thing is the document was so technical that they wouldn't have understood what you were asking them for. So are those, I mean, they're not environmental issues, but are they items you can bring up?
Yeah, definitely. There's sort of what I would consider procedural issues or noticing issues. So there are specific requirements for how lead agencies have to notice meetings and provide information to the public. But I think regardless of what the technical requirements are for noticing, I think all of your points sound very reasonable. And if we go back to one of Carmen's slides, which was talking about kind of the purpose of CEQA and public involvement and public engagement, that's not being served if it's completely incomprehensible what the project is about. So I think it's good comments to make, and even if it doesn't like win the day on a particular project, having those comments, if you're participating in these processes at your city repeatedly and they keep hearing from multiple people, we need to do better at public engagement. That's where you can affect some political change as well.
And is there any companies that you can hire to kind of help you with the kind of looking at EIR and helping you with comments? Because I'd sure like to know if there was.
Yeah, well, that's what our firm does. So this is
Okay.
not all a big long pitch for our firm, but law firm, there are a number of law firms that do. We're one of them. And I think it's really going to be law firms. Carmen, do you know, are there, like, I don't think there are just like straight up planning places that do it.
No, not typically, because they have so many conflicts. You know,
Mhm.
they'll work for
Yeah,
city and county,
yeah.
so they can't turn around and criticize them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so if you, again, Google around for like environmental law firms or CEQA law firms, you'll pull up, it's law firms and solo practitioners, but it's usually attorneys. They cost money, you know. That's why people.
Jonathan put something in the chat about that.
Mm.
Well, I mean, I just added myself. I said, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but I could help explain things a little bit easier. It's
And you have.
yeah, it's unfortunate. In the Central Valley, we have a thing called a brain drain, where we don't have as much as resources in terms of protecting ourselves on things. It's a lot of it is in the bigger cities, and so we have to, you know, be resilient. We have to be on top of these sort of things, and sometimes it takes pushing ourselves to get into it, to learn it, to teach others as well.
Yeah, and I should say that there's also the Attorney General's office for the state of California. They have an environmental justice division now. And so if you have concerns about a project, you can reach out to them. You know, they also have limited resources, but if it's going to be, they've shown a lot of, I think they've shown a lot of interest in projects that are going to have bad air pollution impacts in disadvantaged communities and other areas where there's already really bad air pollution. So that's another resource.
Great.
All right, well, thank you all for, I'll turn it back to Scott, but I just wanted to say thank you for hanging in there and participating. And I hope we taught something that was not too technical or not too boring. So, so anyway, it was fun to spend the evening together again.
Really, the only thing I have to add, since we probably won't see you at the next one, is just a huge gratitude for all the work that you've put in there. So if you're here, please give them electronic or a physical clapping and say thank you so much. And as I started the workshop out with, just letting you know that the third in the series will be led by Catholic Charities. And so they will be tackling the third one. So look for more information to come from them. And I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to make that one either, but it's been certainly a pleasure to work with you all through this process. And I really appreciate all the great questions and investment. And again, to Shoot-Mohali and Weinberger, thank you so much for all that you've done for this.
Oh,
it really made it
our
great.
pleasure.
So thank you so much. Everybody have a great evening. Get back to your families, your dinners, whatever you got going on. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.